Welcome to the Lecture 5 Deeper Dive. We're going to talk about 1920s politics and Warren G. Harding. Next couple other videos, we'll talk about Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover as president outside of the Great Depression. The first thing we go over, when we talk about politics in the 1920s is historians see a shift politically from the progressive era of the first couple of decades of the 20th century into World War I, shifting politics to more what I guess current day we'd label quote-unquote conservative, meaning not progressive, not really big on progressive reform or crusading for causes. And so in the 1920s, we see Republican control of the White House and Congress, pretty straight from March of 1921 to March of 1933. We have a more business-friendly environment. You have support for prohibition, which is kind of interesting. During the progressive era, the couple of decades before World War I, you saw progressives championing prohibition, and more quote unquote conservative politicians or elected officials not liking prohibition. The government shouldn't be telling people, what they should drink and not drink. Whereas progressive reformers viewed prohibition as a reform of society. Americans drink too much, and so if you can just get Americans to stop drinking, utopia can begin, right? Interestingly enough, as we get into prohibition, we see the progressive point of view becoming getting rid of prohibition, and more conservative elements wanting to keep it, more religious individuals wanting to keep prohibition because it maintained the moral Christian society of that era. And so it's kind of an interesting switch with prohibition. You see more business-friendly environment. You don't see government, state, and federal government hot to regulate business and tell business what to do. So more specifically, though, let's talk about the three presidents during the 1920s. This video will talk about Warren G. Harding. And then I'll do one on Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. So Warren G. Harding. Here's a picture of him. His first election, or his only election, presidential election, 1920. He ran on the slogan of "Return to Normalcy." A foreign policy highlight is the Washington Naval Conference. He does die in office, and so those headlines to get you interested in reading more about Warren G. Harding. To go into a little more detail about his life and his presidency, Harding was born in 1865 in Blooming Grove, Ohio. His dad was a doctor. His mother was a teacher. And, some historians argue or would say that Harding's, rural, small town, upbringing really shapes his perspective and his point of view for consensus, sociability, and incrementalism rather than ideological crusades. And so that's when you study when you study Harding, he's not politically progressive in that, he doesn't view things as, there should be this ideological crusade. The government's job isn't to go on these moral crusades of progressivism. Interesting early career for Harding. When he was 19, he purchased the Marion Star, a failing newspaper. And so, it tells you maybe a couple things. One, buying a paper was pretty cheap back then, probably. His editorial style was calm and conciliatory. He tended to avoid sensationalism, which is interesting during that era. Late 19th century, you had yellow journalism. That's how you sold papers, right? Just send me the pictures and I'll write the war, right? He earned a lot of influence in Marion, helped him build a political network. Harding got into politics. He served in the Ohio State Senate, 1899 to 1903. Lieutenant Governor of Ohio, 1904 to 1906, and he served as a U.S. Senator. His first election, 1914, he wins, Republican from Ohio, so he'll serve in the U.S. Senate until he runs for president. When you study Harding's speeches, they emphasize limited federal government in the economy, or federal intervention in the economy. He supported business expansion, high protective tariffs to protect business. His speeches urged fiscal restraint on what the federal government spent money on. He believed the federal government should create stability, not direct economic life, which, when you study progressivism, is, definitely progressive politicians and economists think the job of government is to direct people's economic lives. And so there's definitely a big difference for Harding there. I mentioned a minute ago his famous 1920s slogan, "Return to normalcy." And that's kind of the point. What is normal? What is stable? Okay. And so his return to normalcy captured that. What wasn't normal? What was normal? You're viewing the progressive era, World War I, the flu pandemic, 1918, the Red Scare, Wilson's intense moralistic progressivism. This return to morality, normalcy that Harding ran on was this idea that government should return to less moralizing from Washington, more cooperation with business, a calmer foreign policy, meaning you wouldn't get involved in European wars, a restoration of civil liberties curtailed during wartime. That was a big deal. Violations of the First Amendment for dissenting against our participation in World War I. Harding opposed the League of Nations, arguing it compromised U.S. sovereignty. Most historians don't consider him an isolationist, though. During his presidency, the U.S. maintained its economic, political, and military interventions in the Caribbean, Central and South America, and so we're heavily involved in that region. We're definitely interested in the Pacific, and so a lot of times when we say America's isolationist back then, a lot of times what it means is, well, we're isolationist towards Europe, right? But we're definitely interventionist when it comes to the Pacific and Latin America. The highlight I mentioned a minute ago being the Washington Naval Conference. Interesting story. I did a paper in graduate school on the Washington Naval Conference. I guess if you're going, what's the most boring topic one could pick for a graduate class research paper. Maybe the Washington Naval Conference would be it. But what's interesting is about the Washington Naval Conference, it's an early example of how the U.S. government viewed Japan as a competitor in the Pacific. The whole point of the Washington Naval Conference was to get Japan to agree to restrict its naval building program. We're willing to limit our Navy to some extent if it keeps the Japanese limited. And so that's what's interesting about the Washington Naval Conference. It's an example of, you're competing with Japan in the Pacific. They are building a Pacific fleet just like you are. They are interested in the Pacific Rim, Pacific Ocean, just like you are. They're interested in the Philippines and China, just like you are. And so the Washington Naval Conference is an example of, you, the British, a few other countries, Italians, France, work with Japan on getting Japan to agree to limit its capital ships. It would be like battleships and a new type of a ship, aircraft carriers. And so you have the signing of that. Another interesting about the Washington Naval Conference is it's limiting big ships like aircraft carriers and battleships, but it leaves open a whole category of all kinds of smaller ships, submarines, cruisers, all that. And so what's interesting is all these countries that signed on to it, England, France, Italy, U.S., Japan, fine, we won't build battleships or aircraft carriers, so what do? They build a ton of submarines, cruisers, destroyers, smaller ships. And so, and the effect of that is when you get to World War II, I don't know if you guys realize or think it's kind of interesting. The U.S. in World War II, Japan in World War II, had very few aircraft carriers. I think if I remember correctly, both countries had under 10. It was like 5 or 9. I probably should have looked at it before I made the video, I guess. But the U.S. fleet had very few aircraft carriers, not a ton of battleships. Same thing for Japan, but a whole ton of smaller vessels that allowed both Japan and the U.S. to create battle groups. So you'd have one large aircraft carrier and then a couple dozen smaller ships around it. So the Washington Naval Conference, greatly affects how World War II was fought. So anyways, the Washington Naval Conference demonstrates the U.S. on the global stage, not as isolationist, I guess, as we're kind of led to believe in popular history. Again, my argument to you as well, it's more, it might be isolationist toward Europe, but we're definitely interested in Latin America, Mexico South, and the Pacific. Harding did support the Dyer bill, which was a Congress passing anti-lynching legislation. He is one of the few candidates during that era. He would give civil rights speeches while I'm campaigning in the South, which was not the most safe thing to do during that era, I guess you could say. Not the most politically good or correct thing to do at the time. But he did speak on civil rights, even going to the South a few times and giving speeches. He did campaign as president with prominent suffragettes, women who were advocating, the federal women voting. By Harding's era, half the states in the Union allowed women voting. During this era, they're just arguing for a federal amendment to require women voting in all elections, federal and down. Wilson does win the election in 1920, again on that return to normalcy. People wanted to World War One, flu pandemic, a moralistic, progressive, trying to tell everyone what to do, doesn't fly anymore. People want to return to what else. They want to, a house and a chicken pot in every stove or something like that. Right. There is a pretty bad post-World War I recession that Harding will have to take on, and that's also one of the reasons why Harding won in 1920 is there is a post-war recession, and so voters are choosing to elect the Republican candidate who's running on again that return to normal economic life that'll bring prosperity. During his presidency, we see him creating the Bureau of the Budget, and now the OMB. It centralizes federal budgeting for the first time. He signs the bill, Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which set up the beginning of kind of setting up procedures and rules for how the federal government budgets its money. You do see tax cuts and reduction of federal spending, especially militarily, as you're winding down from World War I. Harding signed the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. It was the first time the U.S. government placed numerical limits on immigration, and graded it by the certain numbers going to certain groups of people. So, immigrants from Northern and Western Europe received the highest amount. We already know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration. This continues the policy of setting Chinese immigration at 0, Japanese lower, as you view Asian populations as not assimilatable. Harding did, when you read the primary documents, you do see there is documents where Harding expresses discomfort with the quotas feeling they're kind of overly harsh or onerous. But he does sign the bill anyways as kind of just the political mood at the time. Interestingly enough, even though he sided with business, there is the 1922 railroad shopman strike and the coal strike of 1922 where even though you see Harding supporting business, he does use federal injunctions and mediation to bring both sides labor management to the table. So it's not the 19th century anymore, even with pro-business governments, right? Where you can just send in the military and start shooting the protesters, or shooting the strikers. And so what you see here is Harding stepping in but forcing mediation. So the biggest scandal during his presidency is generally called the Teapot Dome scandal. The U.S. Interior Secretary Albert Fall, during his presidency, secretly leased naval oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. And so that's the big kind of, that's the big scandal of the Harding presidency. While Teapot Dome gets kind of all the oxygen, the sexy topic, you have the Veterans Bureau Director Charles Forbes stealing medical supplies. You took kickbacks on hospital construction. In the Justice Department, Harding's Attorney General was implicated in influence peddling schemes where you kind of give me money and I'll give you kind of what you need or want. And so kind of what's interesting is it kind of leads to Harding's kind of famous saying, "My God, this is hell of a job. I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies all right, but my damn friends, they're the ones that keep me up fighting the Lord at night." So that was interesting. So anyway, so it's kind of a private observation by Harding. Harding will die in 1923, in August 1923, in San Francisco. While he's during that era, presidents would do railroad tours. And there's a Voyage of Understanding. This is the title of that tour. Kind of a common thing for president to do during the era. He will die of what's believed to be a heart attack while on the trip. And so that'll be unfortunate for Harding. Some of his scandals come out after he died. For example, he had an affair while a senator. That comes out after. And so while he was president, kind of viewed a little more positively than he did afterwards. Historians today generally don't like Harding because of the scandals. Also, most U.S. historians are Democrats and progressive politically, so they don't like Republicans or conservative politicians. So they generally don't like Harding for those reasons.